My sister Colette was laughing at the dinner table, touching Grandma Dorothea's hand, saying, "We just want what's best for you." And I almost believed she meant it. Then, 3 days later, I found the chat she'd created behind my back. Every family member included, except me, dividing up a $2.3 million inheritance like I didn't exist. Like the 7 years I spent caring for Grandma meant absolutely nothing. What Colette never knew was that Grandma had been reading that chat from the very beginning. If you've ever been the one who showed up and still got left out, stay with me. This one is going to hit close to home. I was standing in Grandma Dorothea's kitchen on a Tuesday evening in late October, and the house smelled the way it always did, like cinnamon and old wood, and something warm that I could never quite name, but always made my chest loosen the moment I walked through the door. I had come to drop off her evening medications, the little plastic organizer I refilled every Sunday without fail, 7 years running. I set my keys on the counter. I called out her name. She didn't answer, which wasn't unusual. She napped hard in the early evenings ever since the second round of treatment. I was about to leave the organizer on the counter and go when the iPad lit up. Just a notification, a small thing. The screen brightened for maybe 3 seconds before going dark again. But in those 3 seconds, I saw the chat name clearly, Grandma's Future Plans. I stood there for a moment. Something in my stomach shifted. Not quite dread, not quite curiosity. Something in between. I told myself it was nothing. A family planning thread, maybe. Someone coordinating a visit. I reached over and touched the screen. 47 messages. My hands were steady when I started reading. They were not steady by the time I reached message 9. My name is Nora. I am 44 years old. I have spent the better part of the last 7 years being the person in this family who shows up. Not because anyone asked me to, not because I was angling for anything, because Dorothea Vance is the woman who raised me when no one else stepped up, and loving her back felt less like a choice and more like breathing. But standing in her kitchen that evening, reading word after word on that glowing screen, I started to understand something that cracked something open inside me that I don't think has fully closed since. My family had been meeting without me, in secret, about her money, about me. Let me take you back, because this story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts about 30 years earlier, in a small house on the east side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where an 11-year-old girl with a suitcase and nowhere else to go knocked on her grandmother's door. My mother, Suzette, was many things. Charming when she needed to be, completely absent when it was inconvenient. When she and my father finally split for good, she didn't fight for custody. She negotiated herself out of it. That's the word I use now, as an adult. Negotiated. When I was 11, I just called it what it felt like, which was being left. My father took my younger brother and moved to his sister's place in Dallas, and I ended up at Grandma Dorothea's. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about bitterness. Grandma Dorothea's house was the best thing that ever happened to me. She was sharp and funny, and she had strong opinions about everything from pie crust to politicians, and she never once made me feel like a burden. She made me feel chosen, like out of everything she could have done with her life at 62. Choosing me was something she did gladly. I grew up in that house. I graduated high school from Tulsa Central. I went to community college 20 minutes away because leaving felt wrong. I got a job, got an apartment nearby, got married briefly and then unmarried, and through all of it, Grandma Dorothea was the fixed point. The thing that didn't move. My mother Suzette drifted in and out of the picture over the years. Holidays sometimes, phone calls occasionally, always with that particular energy of someone who wanted credit for showing up without having to actually stay. My uncle Philip, Grandma's son, built a landscaping business out in Phoenix that did well enough to make him comfortable and self-important in equal measure. He called Grandma on her birthday and at Christmas and considered that sufficient. And then there was my sister Colette. Colette is 4 years younger than me, my mother's daughter from a different relationship, and we grew up separately but stayed connected in the way that half-siblings sometimes do. Not close exactly, but familiar. She settled in Nashville about a decade ago, married a man named Greg who sold commercial real estate, and built a life that looked very polished from the outside. She visited Grandma maybe once a year, sometimes less. None of them were there when Grandma got her first diagnosis. I was. It was a Thursday morning 3 years ago. I drove her to the appointment because she said it was routine. It was not routine. I held her hand in that little consultation room while the doctor used words that made the floor feel unsteady and I drove her home in silence because she asked me not to talk, and I sat with her on the back porch until it got dark, and she finally said, "Well, I suppose we handle it." And we did. Together. The first round of treatment was brutal in the quiet way that brutal things sometimes are. Not dramatic, not loud, just a slow, grinding exhaustion that settled into Grandma Dorothea's bones and refused to leave. She lost weight. She lost her appetite. There were mornings she couldn't get out of bed without help, and evenings she sat in her chair by the window and stared at nothing for so long that I'd have to say her name twice before she came back to me. I was there for all of it. I rearranged my work schedule. I learned which foods she could keep down and which ones turned her stomach. I learned how she liked her pillows stacked and how she wanted the blinds angled in the afternoon and that she needed exactly 1 cup of chamomile tea at 8 o'clock or she wouldn't sleep. I learned her body's rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of someone you love completely, without keeping score. And not once, not a single time, did Colette offer to come. She sent a flower arrangement after the diagnosis. It was beautiful and expensive, and it arrived 2 days after the appointment and sat on Grandma's kitchen table until the petals started dropping. She texted me occasionally asking for updates, always ending with, "Let me know if you need anything," which is the thing people say when they are confident you will never actually ask. Uncle Philip called Grandma once after he heard, told her she was strong, told her the doctors in Phoenix were excellent if she ever wanted a second opinion, and then didn't call again for 6 weeks. Grandma never complained about any of them. That was the thing about Dorothea Vance. She had a dignity that ran so deep it sometimes looked like indifference. She didn't chase people. She didn't beg for presents. She noticed everything and said very little, and I think that quality, that particular stillness, was something her children and grandchildren mistook for contentment, when really it was just grace. The first round of treatment ended. The scans came back better than expected. Grandma got stronger slowly, the way old trees grow. You couldn't see it day to day, but one morning you looked and something had changed. She started cooking again. She started doing the crossword every morning with her coffee. She started giving me her opinions on my hair again, which I took as a very good sign. And that's when they started appearing. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like a tide coming in. First, it was Colette calling more frequently, not just texts, but actual phone calls, her voice warm and interested in a way that felt slightly new. Then Uncle Philip mentioned he was thinking of coming through Tulsa on a business trip and maybe he'd stop by. Then my cousins Brecken and Dex, Philip's kids, started commenting on Grandma's Facebook posts, little heart emojis, and thinking of you messages that I could not remember them ever sending before. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it, but I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself people respond to health scares in different ways, and sometimes it takes a scare to shake people into showing up, and maybe this was genuine. Maybe Grandma's illness had reminded everyone what mattered. I wanted to believe that. I really did. Then Colette called me on a Sunday afternoon in early spring, and her voice had that particular careful quality, measured, almost rehearsed, and she said, "Nora, I think we should all get together at Grandma's this summer, as a family, while we still can. While we still can." I remember the exact way those words landed, not the surface meaning, the meaning underneath, the thing she was actually calculating when she said them. I said that sounded nice. I kept my voice even, but something in me went very quiet after that call. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. They descended on Grandma Dorothea's house that July like people who had never left, comfortable, loud, full of easy laughter, acting as though the years of absence were simply a minor scheduling issue that nobody needed to address. Colette arrived first, driving up in a rented SUV with Greg and 2 rolling suitcases, wearing a sundress, and carrying a pie she had definitely bought at a bakery and definitely not made herself. She hugged Grandma for a long time on the front porch, and I watched from the living room window and told myself to let it be good. To just let it be good. Uncle Philip flew in 2 days later. He looked older than I remembered, heavier around the jaw, a little tired behind the eyes, but he walked into Grandma's house with the energy of a man arriving at something he owned, dropping his bag in the hallway, immediately commenting on the kitchen cabinets and whether Grandma had thought about updating them, whether the house might benefit from some work before. And then he stopped himself mid-sentence and said, "Before winter. The cold gets into these old walls." Before winter. Brecken came with his girlfriend, a quiet woman named Tara, who spent most of the visit looking at her phone, and who I felt genuinely sorry for. Dex came alone, arriving late on a Friday evening smelling like airport bourbon, kissing Grandma on the cheek and calling her his favorite person in the world, which might have been touching if he hadn't gone 4 years without a single visit. Grandma received all of them warmly. That was her way. She sat at the head of her dining table and laughed at their stories, and let Colette fuss over her hair, and let Philip talk about his business, and let Brecken and Dex fill her living room with noise. She looked happy, genuinely happy, in the way that people who have loved difficult people their whole lives look happy when those people finally show up, grateful for the crumbs, not angry about the meal they missed. It made my chest ache in a way I couldn't fully explain. I cooked most of the meals that week. Nobody asked me to. It was simply understood, the way things that have always been true become invisible. I made Grandma's favorites because I knew them by heart. Colette offered to help once, standing in the kitchen doorway with a glass of wine. And when I handed her a cutting board, she looked at it for a moment like it was mildly foreign, and then said she'd better go check on Grandma, and drifted back to the living room. I stood at that stove, and I breathed, and I let it go. There was one evening near the end of the week. Everyone was on the back porch, the sun going orange over the yard, Grandma in her good chair with a sweater over her shoulders, and I came out with a tray of iced tea, and for just one moment I stood in the doorway and looked at all of them together and thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is just family. Messy and imperfect and late, but real. Colette caught my eye from across the porch and smiled at me. I smiled back. 3 days later, she created the group chat, and she did not put me in it. I didn't know about the chat yet. That came later. In those first days after everyone left, the house went quiet again, and life returned to its rhythm. Me and Grandma Dorothea, and the familiar shape of our days together. Morning medications, afternoon walks when she felt strong enough, evening tea at 8. The crossword left open on the kitchen table, with half the answers filled in her handwriting, the other half waiting for me. She seemed different after that visit, though. Not sad exactly, thoughtful, like something had settled in her that she was still sorting through. I asked her once if she was okay, and she looked at me for a long moment. That particular look she had, the one that felt like she was reading something behind your eyes. And she said, "I'm clearer than I've been in a long time, Nora." I didn't know what she meant. I filed it away. Weeks passed, September came, and the Tulsa heat finally broke, and Grandma's garden, which she'd been too tired to tend properly all summer, got a second wind. She was out there one morning deadheading her roses when I arrived, and she looked so much like herself, gloves on, old hat, talking quietly to the plants the way she always did, that something in my chest physically loosened. I stood at the back door and just watched her for a minute and felt something close to peace. Then my phone buzzed. It was Colette. A text, not a call. That should have told me something. Colette called when she wanted warmth, texted when she wanted distance. "Hey, has Grandma mentioned anything to you about her estate plans? Like, has she talked to her attorney recently? Just want to make sure everything is organized properly. For her sake." For her sake. I read it twice. Something cool moved through me. I typed back. "Not that she's mentioned. Why?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "Just want to make sure she has everything in order. You know how these things get complicated. Philip thinks we should all have a conversation soon." I put my phone in my pocket and went out to help Grandma with her roses, and I did not bring it up with her. But that cool feeling didn't leave. It sat in the back of my chest for the rest of the day, like a stone that had no business being there. 2 weeks after that text, I came over on a Tuesday evening and found the iPad on the kitchen counter. Grandma was napping, the house was still, and the screen lit up with that notification. Grandma's future plans, and I stood there in that kitchen I knew better than my own, and I picked it up. I want to tell you that I hesitated, that I put it down and walked away and respected whatever privacy existed in those messages. But I didn't. Something in me, some part that had been quietly uneasy for weeks, some part that recognized the shape of what was happening even before my conscious mind caught up. Something in me needed to know. So I read it, and the first message I saw was from Colette. "Okay, so I talked to a property attorney. If Grandma's will hasn't been updated in the last 5 years, we have grounds to push for a formal review. Nora has had way too much access and influence. That needs to be documented." My legs went. I sat down on the kitchen floor without deciding to. The tile was cold through my jeans. I kept reading, Message after message after message. I sat on that cold kitchen floor, and I read every single one, and with each one something inside me went quieter and colder, in a way that was somehow worse than if I had been screaming. Uncle Philip had responded to Colette's first message within minutes. Agreed. I've thought this for a while. She basically moved herself into that woman's life. Classic manipulation. Dorothea wouldn't know how to say no to her even if she wanted to. I read that sentence 3 times. Classic manipulation. 7 years of medications and appointments and sleepless nights and learning how she liked her pillows and sitting with her in that consultation room when the floor went unsteady. And the word they had chosen for all of it was manipulation. Brecken had jumped in next. Honestly, it's kind of calculated if you think about it. Nora never left Tulsa, never built her own life, just stayed close and made herself useful. That's not devotion, that's strategy. My hands were shaking by then, not dramatically, just a fine, constant tremor that I couldn't stop no matter how tightly I held the iPad. Dex had added, "She'll cry the hardest at the funeral and walk away with the most. Bet on it." There it was, right there in plain text. My cousin, whom I had welcomed into my grandmother's home 3 months earlier, who had kissed her cheek and called her his favorite person, writing those words in a secret chat while I was in the next room making everyone dinner. I kept reading because I couldn't stop. It was the kind of pain that has its own momentum. Colette had sent a longer message further down, clearly written carefully, the kind of message you draft and redraft before sending. She laid out what she called the situation, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time. She talked about the house value. She talked about the investment accounts. She mentioned a figure, 2.3 million, with a casualness that made my stomach turn, like she had been sitting with that number so long it had become comfortable in her mouth. Then she wrote, "The problem is Nora has had years to work on her. We don't actually know what's in that will right now, and that's the issue. She basically imprisoned that old woman. We need to contest before it's too late." Imprisoned. I looked up from the screen. The kitchen was the same as it had always been. Same curtains Grandma had hung 20 years ago. Same ceramic rooster on the counter she'd bought at a flea market in 1987 and refused to get rid of no matter what anyone said. Same smell of cinnamon and wood and that warm unnamed thing. Everything exactly the same. And yet something had shifted permanently in the way I understood the world. I thought about calling someone. My hands actually moved toward my contacts before I stopped myself. I thought about walking into Grandma's bedroom and waking her up and showing her the screen. I thought about calling Colette right then, letting her hear my voice and know that I knew. I did none of those things. Instead, I went very still, and I thought clearly for the first time since I'd picked up that iPad. I thought about what I actually had in my hands and what the smartest thing to do with it was. I opened my own email. I screenshotted every single message, all 47, and sent them to myself one by one. Then I put the iPad back exactly where it had been, screen down, angle precise. I picked up Grandma's medication organizer. I set it on the counter next to her water glass. I let myself out quietly, locked the door behind me with my key, and sat in my car in her driveway for 22 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a single message. I went home, and I sat with what I knew, and I waited. The waiting was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Not the reading, as devastating as that was. Not even the full weight of what my family had said about me settling into my bones over the following days, which it did, slowly and completely, the way cold gets into a house when the heat goes out. The hardest part was going back to Grandma Dorothea's every single day and acting like nothing had changed. Handing her the medication organizer, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, watching her do the crossword, having normal conversations about her garden and the neighbor's new dog, and whether the bakery on 7th Street had gotten worse or whether she had just gotten more particular about her pie. Acting normal when I was anything but. There were moments I almost broke. One afternoon, about a week after I'd read the messages, Grandma looked up from her crossword and studied my face in that way she had, that deep, unhurried reading, and she said, "You seem tired, Nora, a different kind of tired." I looked at her across that kitchen table, and I wanted so badly to tell her. The words were right there. I almost let them out. Instead, I said, "Long week at work. I'm okay." She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked back down at her crossword and said, in a tone that meant she didn't entirely believe me, but was choosing not to press. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing as I sat across from her performing normalcy, was that Grandma Dorothea already knew everything. She had known for weeks. The old iPad on the kitchen counter wasn't there by accident. Grandma had noticed the chat notifications appearing on it sometime in late August, not long after Colette created the group. She had read them. All of them. She had sat in her kitchen in the early morning quiet and read every word her daughter and her son and her grandchildren had written about the woman who had cared for her through cancer, and she had felt whatever she felt. And then she had done something very Dorothea about it. She had said nothing to anyone. She had simply begun to act. The week after I found the chat, while I was sitting in my car in her driveway trying to remember how to breathe, Grandma had quietly called her attorney, a methodical man named Gerald, who had handled her affairs for 15 years. She asked him to come to the house. She showed him the iPad. She told him she wanted the will updated, and she wanted it done properly, and she wanted it done soon. Gerald came on a Wednesday morning while I was at work, and by the time I arrived that evening with her Thursday medications, the paperwork had already been signed and witnessed. She never mentioned it to me. She just kept doing the crossword, kept tending her roses, kept watching her evening programs and drinking her chamomile tea at 8 o'clock and being exactly who she had always been, steady and quiet and several steps ahead of everyone in the room. About 2 weeks after Gerald's visit, Colette called Grandma directly. I only found this out later. She used her warmest voice, the one she deployed like a tool, and she steered the conversation carefully toward the subject of the house, toward the future, toward whether Grandma had thought about what she wanted things to look like. Grandma listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When Colette finished, Grandma said, "I have thought about it quite a lot, actually. I have everything handled, sweetheart." Colette told the group chat that same evening that she thought Grandma seemed confused and that they needed to move faster. Gerald had already filed the paperwork 2 weeks prior. The call came on a Thursday morning, in the first week of November. It was Grandma Dorothea herself, which was unusual. She was not a phone call person by nature, preferring to simply tell me things when I arrived in person. But she called at 9 in the morning, her voice clear and composed, and she said, "Nora, I'd like everyone to come to the house, the whole family. I'm going to need you to help me reach people since I don't have everyone's numbers current." I asked her if everything was okay. She said, "Everything is exactly as it should be." Something in her voice, not warmth exactly, more like a kind of settled certainty, made me sit up straighter without knowing why. I said I'd make the calls. She said 2 weeks from Saturday would be fine, and that Gerald would be joining them, and she'd appreciate if everyone could be there in person. I made the calls. Colette answered immediately, and her voice had that bright, slightly breathless quality it gets when she thinks something is moving in her direction. She said, "Of course, absolutely. She and Greg would be there." She would fly in Friday evening. Uncle Philip said he'd rearrange his schedule, said it with the gravity of a man doing something significant, though we both knew his calendar had never once included a trip to Tulsa that wasn't entirely convenient for him. Brecken confirmed within the hour. Dex took 2 days to respond and then said he'd be there. I did not tell any of them that Gerald would be present. Grandma had not asked me to mention it, and so I didn't. The 2 weeks leading up to that Saturday had a particular quality I still find difficult to describe. I knew something was coming. I didn't know the full shape of it. Grandma gave nothing away. She was warm and present and completely herself during my daily visits. And if she was carrying the weight of what she was about to do, she wore it invisibly, the way she wore most heavy things. The family arrived the Friday before, filtering into Tulsa with their rolling suitcases and their rented cars and their carefully arranged expressions of familial concern. Colette brought flowers again, different ones this time, an autumn arrangement, burnt orange and deep red. She hugged Grandma in the doorway and said, "You look wonderful, Grandma. You really do." Grandma thanked her and meant none of it and showed nothing. That evening, everyone gathered in the living room, and the conversation stayed light, careful, surface level, no one quite willing to name the thing that sat in the center of the room unacknowledged. Uncle Philip talked about his business. Brecken showed Grandma pictures on his phone. Dex laughed too loudly at his own jokes. Colette kept refreshing everyone's drinks with the energy of a woman running for something. I sat in the corner armchair and watched all of it, and kept my face completely neutral. At one point, Colette came and sat on the arm of the sofa near me and said quietly, "Do you have any idea what this is about? Did she say anything to you?" I looked at her. My sister. The woman who had written that I had imprisoned our grandmother. I said, she just said she wanted everyone together. Colette searched my face for a moment, found nothing, nodded, and went back to refreshing drinks. That night, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, from something that felt almost like stillness, like the particular quiet that exists in the seconds before something long overdue finally arrives. Saturday morning came gray and cool. Gerald's car was already in the driveway when the family came downstairs. The smiles in that hallway, I watched them change in real time. Gerald was already seated at the dining room table when everyone filed in. A composed, silver-haired man with a leather portfolio in front of him and the particular stillness of someone who has sat in difficult rooms before and found them manageable. He nodded at people as they entered. He did not make small talk. Grandma Dorothea was seated at the head of the table. She was dressed in her good blouse, the deep blue one she saved for occasions she considered significant, and her hair was done, and her hands were folded in front of her, and she looked, more than anything, like a woman who had decided something and was completely at peace with the decision. Colette walked in and saw Gerald, and her steps slowed almost imperceptibly. Her eyes moved to Grandma, then back to Gerald, then to the portfolio. Greg, her husband, put a hand on the small of her back. Uncle Philip came in behind them and his expression shifted in a way that he tried immediately to smooth over, something between recognition and recalculation. Brecken and Dex found chairs without speaking. Everyone settled. The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Gerald opened the portfolio. He introduced himself to the room formally. His name, his firm, his role as Dorothea Vance's attorney of 15 years. He said that Mrs. Vance had asked him here today to read the terms of her updated will and that Mrs. Vance would be speaking afterward. Colette's chin came up slightly at the word updated. Gerald read clearly and without drama. The house on Clearwater Drive, to Nora. The investment accounts totaling approximately $2.3 million. To Nora, with a specific charitable allocation to a cancer research fund in Grandma's name. Her jewelry, with the exception of 2 specific pieces, her mother's bracelet to a cousin named Faye, who had called every single week without fail and never once appeared in the group chat, and her pearl earrings to a neighbor named Bet, who had brought soup every Thursday during treatment without being asked. Personal items and furniture, to Nora, to distribute as she saw fit. Colette's hands were flat on the table. Uncle Philip was looking at a point somewhere above Gerald's head. Brecken had gone very still. Dex was looking at the table. Gerald closed the portfolio. He looked at Grandma Dorothea and gave a small nod, and Grandma spoke. Her voice was even, not cold. Dorothea Vance was never cold, but steady in a way that made the room feel smaller. She said she wanted to say a few things directly, and she hoped everyone would let her finish before responding. Nobody moved. She said she had been reading a group chat for approximately 2.5 months. She said it had been created by Colette in late August and had been accessible to her through a device in her kitchen without anyone's knowledge. She said she had read every message. Then she began to quote them. She looked at Uncle Philip and she said, "Classic manipulation." Dorothea wouldn't know how to say no to her even if she wanted to. She said it in a tone that was almost gentle. Philip's jaw tightened. She looked at Brecken and quoted his message about strategy word for word. Brecken opened his mouth and closed it. She looked at Dex and said his words back to him. The ones about the funeral, about walking away with the most. And Dex looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Then she looked at Colette. The room held its breath. She basically imprisoned that old woman. Grandma said quietly, her eyes steady on her granddaughter's face. Those are your words, Colette. About me. About the woman who is sitting right in front of you. Colette's eyes filled. She started to speak. Grandma, Grandma said her name. Just her name. One word, spoken quietly. Colette stopped. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. Grandma Dorothea did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She sat at the head of her table in her good blue blouse, with her hands folded, and she looked at each of them in turn. Colette, Philip, Brecken, Dex, with an expression that I can only describe as complete clarity, like a woman who had already processed her grief about this privately and had arrived here today simply to close a door. She said, I know who sat with me when I couldn't get out of bed. I know who learned which foods I could keep down after treatment. I know who was in that consultation room when I got my diagnosis and held my hand when the floor felt unsteady. And now I know what each of you said when you believed I couldn't hear you. She paused. Let it settle. I am not angry, she said. I want you to understand that. What I am is finished. Finished pretending I don't know what I know. Finished allowing people who treat my home like an inheritance they're waiting to collect to also treat themselves like family. She told Gerald the meeting was complete. Gerald gathered his portfolio and stood and excused himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen variations of this room before and felt no need to linger in it. Colette found her voice then. Her tone shifted. The warmth dropped away, and what was underneath was harder and more familiar to me, the version of my sister that emerged when things didn't go her direction. She said this wasn't fair, that she had been misunderstood, that the chat was taken out of context, that she had only been trying to protect the family's interests. Grandma listened to all of it without expression. When Colette finished, Grandma said, I appreciate you explaining that. And then she stood up from the table, which was the end of the meeting, and she walked to the living room and sat in her chair by the window. Nobody quite knew what to do after that. Philip left first, stood, buttoned his jacket, said something tight and formal about a flight to catch, and was gone within 20 minutes. Brecken and Dex followed without much ceremony. Colette stayed the longest, moving through the house with the stunned quality of someone who had walked into a wall in the dark. She tried once more to speak to Grandma privately, and I don't know exactly what was said, but the conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, and when Colette came back through the living room, her eyes were red and her mouth was set, and she picked up her bag and left without saying goodbye to me. The house went quiet. I sat with Grandma that afternoon for a long time. We didn't talk much. She had her tea, I had mine. The light came through the curtains the way it always did, and the ceramic rooster sat on the counter, and the crossword was open on the table with half the answers in her handwriting, and everything was exactly the same and completely different. At some point, she reached over and put her hand on top of mine, and she said, You never said a word, did you, when you found out? I looked at her. You knew I'd seen it? She smiled, that small, unhurried smile. I know everything that happens in my kitchen, Nora. I laughed. For the first time in weeks, I actually laughed, and it felt like something releasing in my chest that had been held too tight for too long. The months that followed were not simple. Uncle Philip retained an attorney. The contest lasted 4 months and resolved in Grandma's favor without much drama because Gerald had done everything precisely and correctly, and there was nothing to challenge. Colette sent a long email, 14 paragraphs, every one of them a variation of the belief that she had been wronged. I read it once and did not respond. Grandma Dorothea passed on a Tuesday morning in late April, 8 months after that Saturday. I was holding her hand. The others did not make it in time. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it simply because it is what happened and because it is the final and most honest measure of who showed up and who didn't. I think about her every day. I think about that kitchen, that crossword, that chamomile tea at 8 o'clock. I think about the way she said my name when she put her hand over mine. I think about what it means to be truly known by someone, not performed for, not managed, not impressed, just known, quietly and completely, the way she knew me. She left me everything. But the thing she left me that I carry closest isn't in any document Gerald filed. It's the memory of a woman who read every ugly word written about her in secret and chose not to become bitter about it, who instead got very clear, very quiet, and very intentional. I try to be more like that every day. I don't always manage it, but I try.